Great War is the defining event of the 20th century, a cataclysm that claimed millions of lives and 4 empires, shattered the West's serene sense of self-confidence and of inevitable, gentle, forward progress. And it didn't just usher in the Jazz Age and Dada. From its morass arose Nazism and World War II, Bolshevism and the Cold War. All the major problems of the 20th century, even the convulsions of the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s that saw Canadian troops involved, came out of the disintegration of the Versailles settlement. And yet, the West did win the war. And for Canada, there's something very positive that came out of the war. The feeling that here at Vimy Ridge in 1917, we became a nation. Our nominal independence as of 1867 turned into something very real. We had a seat at the table as a proud member of the Western Alliance. Please join me for a look at the Great War in all its aspects, its origins, its tactics and strategy, the suffering and human loss, the innovation and the geopolitical consequences, as well as the Canadian sense of nationhood. Looking back on the ghastly slaughter and grisly geopolitical consequences of the First World War, a lot of people are tempted to jeer at the widespread conviction back in 1914 that it would be short and glorious and the boys would be back by Christmas. Surely they should have known, as we do, that between modern technology and stupid generals, a bloody horror lasting more than 4 years would ensure that many of the boys never came home at all. We are so wise with the benefit of hindsight. Or are we? Because the remarkable thing is, it almost was a short war. It began with the French totally falling into the German trap. The idea behind the Schlieffen Plan is that while the French attacked in the south, trying to recapture Alsace-Lorraine, which they'd lost in the War of 1870, the German army would wheel through Belgium, break the link between the British and the French, sweep past Paris, trap the French army, and repeat their triumph in the Franco-Prussian War on a larger scale. And it very nearly worked. Everything was going just fine up to the point where they swept past Paris. But then General Gallieni, who'd served his country with distinction from Indochina to the Sudan, but was now the superannuated commander of the Paris garrison, and who'd held back his troops when he'd been urged to commit them earlier, realized that with these newfangled Parisian taxicabs, like this one here at the Musée de la Grande Guerre in Meaux, east of Paris, he could transport thousands of fresh troops to the battlefield at the decisive time in the decisive place on the Germans' exposed right flank. And he did. Hundreds of taxis, thousands of troops turned the tide. The Germans were forced to retreat, the trench lines got dug, and after 4 long and bitter years, the Allies won a war they would have lost before Christmas 1914 if it weren't for an old man with a new idea, that mechanized warfare could save the day. With the perspective afforded by hindsight, it's easy to see why the First World War would involve so much butchery. There are technical reasons why it happened. All kinds of inventions, for instance, smokeless powder. Theodore Roosevelt talks about this in his account of the Spanish-American War, that bullets would be flying all around you and you had no idea where they were coming from. I mean, one of the reasons they wore brightly colored uniforms in earlier wars is the guns were giving such a haze of smoke that everybody knew where you were anyway. Also, mass production of quality steel created all kinds of new weapons, from shells to machine guns. And petrochemicals meant high explosives, more effective munitions, but also rifles. There's an account of the Boer War by Sergeant Hart McHargs of the Royal Canadian Regiment, where he comments on the fact that battlefields in the Boer War were empty. Anybody who was visible was dead. And that was certainly a feature of the First World War. The very first British action at Mons in August of 1914, a small British expeditionary force, about 100,000 men. Bismarck once dismissed it, saying if the British ever landed an army in Germany, he'd send a policeman to arrest it. But when a far superior German force attacked the BEF, they met such rapid and accurate rifle fire, they thought they were walking into machine guns. And again, after the Germans were rebuffed in the Miracle of the Marne, and they tried to drive to the sea at what is called First Ypres in late 1914, the British rifle fire slaughtered them in such quantities that the Germans call that their Kindermord, the death of the children. Curious footnote to history, by the way, one German soldier decorated for bravery in that battle, rescuing a comrade under fire, was named Adolf Hitler. But you put all these technological factors together, including the French developing recoilless artillery, so a gun could fire rapidly and accurately, you didn't have to reposition it after each shell. It's no wonder that battles like the attack here at Loos in the fall of 1915 were futile slaughters. It's hard to see how it could be any other way, at least with the perspective of hindsight. One of the curious idées fixes about the First World War is that it was fought stupidly. After the miracle on the Marne prevented the Germans from winning a quick victory in the fall of 1914, it's often supposed men spent 4 years hiding in muddy holes and then jumping out to be machine gunned on the orders of generals as lacking in compassion as they were in imagination. But it wasn't like that at all. Remember, this is a new kind of warfare with new technology, and people on both sides, generals, captains and privates, were fumbling to figure out how to fight it effectively. And they came up with ingenious, elaborate solutions. Remember, the whole Western Front is under 800 kilometers, but there's something like 32,000 kilometers of trenches. There's a front line, a second line, a third line, communication trenches between them, saps out into no man's land. The trenches zig and zag so that if a shell bursts in a trench, it won't kill men for a great distance either way. And if an enemy soldier gets in, he can't shoot in either direction for a long distance. And if you look at this elaborate reconstructed trench here at the Musée de la Grande Guerre in Meaux, you could see what an elaborate thing a trench became. There are places for men to rest, places for men to fight. There's a firing step, there's a machine gun. Down there's a trench mortar. There's also places to store food, ammunition, and water. Of course, there are also rats and other filth. I mean, it is a trench. There are limits to what you can do. But that's the point. The technology imposed these limits. It was very hard to carry out offensive operations, and so people used a great deal of ingenuity figuring out how to conduct trench warfare. The problem is, they exercised it on both sides, and that's why men spent 4 years in dreadful settings like this one.
To relieve pressure on France and Britain reeling under the initial German onslaught of 1914, Russia mounted a hasty offensive into East Prussia that ended in ominous disaster. At Tannenberg at the end of August, the entire Russian Second Army was lured into a trap and destroyed. 170,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The commanding general, Samsonov, shot himself. Its vast population and territory and forbidding winters let Russia survive, though it could not mount another offensive for 2 years. But the catastrophe revealed the hollowness of the St. Petersburg regime. Though Russia had been a great power at the councils and wars of Europe since Peter the Great in early 18th century, it was so backward economically, organizationally, and socially that at Tannenberg its untrained soldiers could not even encode their radio messages, which the Germans read at will. And if years of industrial warfare would strain France, Britain, and Germany, they would break Russia. Tannenberg didn't cause the Bolshevik Revolution directly, but it showed the cavernous weakness of Russia's military, its government, and even its society, all of which would collapse disastrously in 1917.
The First World War is a difficult war to understand 100 years later. I think when we look back on it, we have a hard time making sense of why Europe went to war and why this became a world war. But if you try to understand events in the context of the time, of what people thought, they really did think that Germany was a major threat, that the Kaiser's militaristic attitude had to be stopped. Of course, Germany invaded Belgium at the start of the war. That was a neutral country, and that's what dragged Britain into the war and ultimately Canada into the war. And it occupied, that's Germany, Germany occupied Belgium, about 90% of the country during the war. It occupied about 15% of France. So if you were a Frenchman, this was an absolutely crucial war, an absolutely necessary war. Your country was being occupied. All of Belgium was being occupied. Thousands of Belgians were executed by German soldiers during the course of the war. Now, it may be a little harder to understand why Britain went to war. It went to war to support Belgium, went to war to support France, its ally, but really for balance of power. It didn't want Germany to rule all of Europe. And for Canada to go to war, well, we had no say over that. When Britain went to war on the 4th of August, 1914, Canada was automatically at war. And at that time, very much among Canadians, especially English Canadians, there was a strong desire to stand shoulder to shoulder with Britain.
In a very real sense, the tragedy of 1914 began here in this room in Bazilles, near Sedan, in 1870. Because it was here that a group of French Marines, fighting heroically on French soil for the first time, resisted to the last bullet. This is now the Musée de la Dernière Cartouche, but were unable to stop the Bavarians from capturing the house, from capturing the town, completing the encirclement of the French army at Sedan, along with their hapless Emperor Napoleon III. The army was forced to surrender, along with the emperor. The Second Empire ended. And the Third Republic attempted to continue the fight, but in the spring of 1871, they too were forced to surrender. In the process, Germany was reunified, Alsace-Lorraine was taken. Now that motivated the French in 1914 to want to go to war and get Alsace-Lorraine back. That's why they attacked in the south. But the tragedy of 1914 begins here in a much deeper sense, because the Franco-Prussian War was very quick. The business ending with the capture of Napoleon didn't even take 2 months. The whole war took less than a year. And that convinced Europeans, whichever side they'd been on in 1870, that the war in 1914 would probably be a quick, glorious war of maneuver also. That's a major reason they overlooked the lesson of the American Civil War, a far bloodier and more protracted conflict fought just a few years earlier with modern technology turning battlefields into slaughterhouses. If they hadn't been for what happened in 1870, people would have looked at what happened in the United States from 1860 to 1865 and been a lot more ready for what was going to happen in Europe in 1914. And if they'd seen it coming, maybe, just maybe, they'd have worked harder to prevent it. One of the most extraordinary things about the First World War is that Britain and France fought it together as allies. You may say, nothing remarkable about that. And they were allies in the Second World War as well. They were allies in the Cold War. They're allies today in NATO. They may occasionally squabble about where the best interests of the Western Alliance lie, but neither of them has any doubt that they're in it for keeps. But it didn't have to be that way. If you look back at the long history of Anglo-French relations, commemorated here at the Château d'Ardelot in Pas-de-Calais, France, you realize that for hundreds of years they were rivals and frequently enemies, fighting battles at Sluis, Crécy, Agincourt, and on. The 7 Years' War, the Plains of Abraham, the Napoleonic Wars. It's often struck me as mildly ironic that a number of veterans of D-Day, Canadian and British, have described how as they approached the beaches there came unbidden into their minds the great speech that Shakespeare put into the mouth of Henry V on the eve of Agincourt about "We happy few, we band of brothers." That business about how old men forget and all shall be forgot, yet he'll remember with advantages what deeds he did this day. But the enemy at Agincourt was the same France those soldiers were now risking their lives to liberate. But when you look back at World War I, and you're often told this is folly from beginning to end, it's important to see that British and French statesmen, who'd almost come to blows as recently as 1898 at Fashoda, both understood that the rising menace of Germany meant they should put this difficult past behind them and unite to face the danger. So you get the Entente Cordiale in 1904, and each of them has a side alliance with Russia. That leads to the Triple Entente in 1907, the configuration that becomes so familiar to us in both world wars and that was essential to preserving the liberty of Western societies. This was as far-sighted as the careful British rapprochement with the Americans of the late 19th and early 20th century, and a tribute to the men who undertook it. Calais itself was fought over. Edward III took it in the early 14th century. He almost massacred all the inhabitants. When the French took it back in the 16th, Bloody Mary, not named for her taste in beverages, said, "When I die you will find Calais engraved on my heart." Instead, you find engraved on the walls the names of British soldiers who during the First World War were treated at the Commonwealth Military Hospital that occupied the premises. If you're looking for the profoundest causes of the Great War, look out there to the North Sea and think about German geopolitical ambitions. It was there that the German High Seas Fleet was meant to beat the Royal Navy and wrest control of the oceans from Britannia. German naval officers toasted Der Tag when that would happen. Also from there that the U-boats fanned out through the North Atlantic, posing a geopolitical threat not merely to Britain, but also to the United States that ultimately brought it into the war, especially after the Germans tried to persuade Mexico to attack the United States on the promise they could have the American Southwest back. Of course, the immediate trigger for the war is the assassination in Sarajevo in June of 1914. But can such great events really have such small causes? And to be sure, the nations of Europe went to war more readily in 1914 than they might have if they hadn't misread the lessons of 1870, 1871, and thought because of the Franco-Prussian War that the First World War would be short and glorious as well. Behind that, there are deeper problems. And so people they'll look at the alliance system, say, well, it was too rickety, or else it was too robust. It allowed pressure to build up explosively. But remember, it was Germany's backing of Austria-Hungary and its ultimatum to Serbia that got the war going. Or they'll look at the need to mobilize an industrial era to get thousands of trains rolling, to get millions of men to the front. Once one nation goes, everyone has to go. And that's true too, but everybody else can mobilize and then wait. Only Germany has to mobilize, then strike, crush France before Russia can get ready, because Germany has the ambition to upset things the way they are. It's Germany that invades its neighbors. Henry Kissinger once summed up the German dilemma by saying, poor Germany, too big for Europe, too small for the world. And maybe it is. But when Germany talked about a place in the sun in those days, everybody else felt that it was going to leave them in the shade. It's revealing that the head of the British Navy, Jacky Fisher, in 1911, predicted that war would come in the summer of 1914. How did he know? Because then the Germans would have finished the Kiel Canal. They could get their dreadnoughts back and forth between the Baltic to fight Russia and the North Sea to fight the British. And it's surely revealing that in December 1912, the Kaiser and his closest advisors held a war conference to plan the event they wanted to happen. When the crisis came in the summer of 1914, the Kaiser said, it's now or never. And that's why it was now. Yes, accident plays a role in war. Yes, there are forces that are hard to control. But men have heads. Men make choices. And it was the choices made in Berlin more than anything else that took the world into the horror we call World War I.
For the people who lived between 1914 and 1918, the prospect of German domination of Europe seemed every bit as frightful as Nazi domination of Europe in the course of the Second World War. You have to remember that when war broke out and the Germans invaded Belgium, the atrocities that were taking place, the burning of Louvain, the execution of Belgian civilians, cast a moral certainty over the war, made people believe that the war was being fought against Prussian militarism. And as the war progressed, it became evident that Germany's war aims included the continued occupation of Belgium, parts of the French coast, most of Eastern Europe, as was evident when they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia. 10 years after the war, when we were talking about the possibility of the rise of Hitler and the rearmament of Germany and a new threat to world security, it was easy to say that the war had been pointless or fruitless. But perhaps the reality was it was the terms of the peace that were pointless or fruitless, that we had not solved the problem of Germany's search for hegemony in Europe at the Treaty of Versailles. And that became the issue. So from a modern day perspective, I think the First World War is looking more and more like a war that we understand had to be fought by the generation that fought it.
After the miracle on the Marne saved Paris, a trench-digging race to the sea produced stalemate in northeastern France and around Ypres in unoccupied Belgium. In spring 1915, French and British attacks failed in Champagne and Neuve-Chapelle. The Germans nearly broke through using poison gas at Ypres in late April. In May, the French suffered 100,000 casualties, failing to capture Vimy, before a summer offensive foundered in the Vosges regions of Alsace. In autumn, the British were bloodied at LOOS-EN-GOHELLE, like the French in Champagne again. Meanwhile, the Central Powers drove Russia out of Poland, only to freeze on the steppes in winter. The frustrated combatants tried innovations from poison gas to underground tunnel mines to Zeppelin bombing of London. But poison gas blew the wrong way. Mines were slow, aerial bombing ineffective. They opened other fronts: Africa, the Balkans, the Middle East, the high seas. But U-boats outraged the mighty neutral United States. The Balkans were too rocky, Africa and the Middle East too far away. There was simply no alternative to a long, bloody siege on the Western Front.
At a certain point, there comes to be a kind of dismal sameness about the Great War memorials like this one here in LOOS-EN-GOHELLE, France. They're beautiful and they're solemn, but these rows and rows of graves, and over again the inscriptions: Lance Corporal M. Taylor, 29th April 1916. This one, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. And there, fresh flowers, a soldier of the Great War, Gordon Highlanders, known unto God. A soldier of the Great War, known unto God. On and on it goes. And then you go and you read the plaque, and it tells you the Battle of Loos in late 1915 was one more dismally failed offensive. Great hopes that came to nothing but bloodshed and loss. And then you read on, and it says the initial bombardment was inadequate. The attackers were slaughtered by machine gun fire. The poison gas blew the wrong way. The minimal gains they actually made, they were so exhausted that the German counterattack pushed them back. Worst day of the British Army so far, though of course far worse was to come the next year on the Somme. And yet, beneath the surface, it's not entirely static. This is the early stage of trench warfare, and men were fumbling on both sides to figure out how to fight it. Here at the Musée Somme 1916 in Albert, France, one of their many imaginative reconstructions shows uniforms from the early part of the war. The British soldier is in camouflage. They'd learned the lesson of the Boer War. But the French soldier from 1914 is wearing red pants. This idea, le pantalon rouge c'est la France, the red pants are France. Unfortunately, they quickly realized the red pants are an easy mark, and by 1915, they were wearing camouflage horizon blue. These reconstructed German trenches at the BAYERNWALD in Flanders, with their authentic wicker sides, wood planking, give you some idea of the intricacy of the trench network, the several lines of communication. Of course, they don't have the underground living quarters, bunkers, and things like that, and they certainly can't convey the stench. But they give you an idea of the cleverness, including this is a sab. It leads out into no man's land. At the end of it, there is a listening tunnel. It's dug down and then out hundreds of meters toward the British position, so they can detect British tunneling efforts by the noise. Now, fortunately, it didn't work. The British did tunnel in and blew this position and captured it in June of 1917. But again, it's important to understand that trenches were hard to take, not because people were stupid, but because they were very clever. To get a sense of the tactical problems confronting Allied soldiers and Allied commanders on the Somme, at Passchendaele, anywhere like that, take a look at these restored German bunkers in Flanders, the BAYERNWALD. No wonder it took the British 2 years to capture a ridge that had machine guns, barbed wire, intricate trench systems, all anchored by almost impenetrable bunkers like this one. This is the back. The front, of course, is completely solid. Now, it's not very luxurious. Apparently, the German soldiers were told, if you want more comfortable bunkers, go capture the British ones. But what kind of tactics would enable you to overcome a position like this? And before you say, oh, well, they just shouldn't have bothered, war's not worth the cost, they should have stopped, remember, these are in Western Belgium. The Germans had conquered Belgium, they had badly mistreated the populace. Were the other Western Allies just meant to say, oh, well, that's fine, you go ahead and keep it, it's too much trouble? But if they weren't going to do that, they had to attack positions like this until they wore the Germans down and found the kind of techniques, including the mining, that would actually let them overcome resistance this solid. The British did learn from the experience here at Loos. They didn't just need more shells, they needed better shells. They needed some whose fragments would cut barbed wire to clear the way for the attacking infantry. They needed others that would penetrate the ground before exploding, so it would kill defenders in their dugouts, so they couldn't come back up and man the machine guns when the assault started. They needed to take more modest objectives and dig in defensively, send another unit to take the next one so they wouldn't be so vulnerable to counterattacks. All the things that Arthur Currie implemented so brilliantly at Vimy Ridge. Trench warfare lasts for 2.5 years at appalling cost, but the fact is, advances were made in military technology and in military techniques that by 1918 had restored a war of movement and maneuver that the Allies did win at this dreadful cost.
There was an even worse theater south of the trenches. Italy was in the pre-war Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but in 1914 refused to fight, claiming the alliance was defensive and Germany started the war. In May 1915, Italy was lured into war against Austria-Hungary by promises of territorial gain and against Germany in August 1916. Unfortunately, Italy was an honorary, not real great power. 11 miserably failed offenses against the hapless Austro-Hungarians foundered in conditions colder and bloodier than the trenches. Shell fire was deadlier in rocky even than muddy terrain. In late 1917, German troops, freed up by the Russian collapse, helped drive the Italians back over 100 kilometers before British and French troops rallied them on the Piave. Finally, when the Central Powers collapsed, Italy seized South Tyrol, Trieste, Trentino, and Istria from the Austrian fragment of the Habsburg Empire. Poor compensation for 651,000 killed and nearly 1 million wounded in battles that didn't matter. Even after following Mussolini into war on the wrong side next time, Italy kept South Tyrol, Trentino, and Trieste.
I think the Great War, it would be wrong to say it was fought stupidly. I think this was a war that everyone was unprepared for. This was a massive war of industrialized nations. They had seen examples of industrialized warfare, the use of modern rifles, machine guns, artillery in the American Civil War, in the Russo-Japanese War, but no one expected the extent of the carnage in 1914. When they were dug in on the Western Front, it became incredibly hard to drive the enemy from their positions, their prepared positions in the ground, behind barbed wire, protected by machine guns and artillery. And so much of the war is spent trying to figure out how to break through, and they introduce poison gas, they introduce the tank, massive artillery bombardments. And by 1916 and 17, there is an evolution in the attack doctrine. There is a change in how they are fighting, using massive amounts of artillery, sophisticated counter-battery attacks, combined arms warfare of infantry and tanks and armored cars. So I think it would be wrong to say that the war was fought stupidly. It was a difficult war, and it was a war that no one had any answers to, and every time you tried to attack, every time you tried to find the riddle to the trenches, it cost you thousands of lives.
The partial reconstruction here at the Vimy Memorial begins to give you an idea of the intricacy of the trench network, though hardly of the depth, the elaborateness of the below-ground compound, and it cannot convey the fear, the boredom that accompanied the terror, and the discomfort. Just being so dirty all the time and be miserable. And then it gives you conditions like trench foot or trench mouth. And the mud wasn't just disgusting, it stank. Millions of men packed into the trench lines for years, corpses decaying, even built into the trench walls, latrines that had been exploded. It is a wonder that the smell alone didn't kill men dead where they stood. As you can see, it's very crowded in this reconstructed British Somme dugout at the Musée Somme 1916 in Albert, France. One of the reasons why is that this is meant to be a little bomb-proof hole in the ground, but the other reason is there's a lot of stuff in here. It's one of the things that's easy to overlook about the Great War is how incredibly materially intensive it was. It wasn't just a bunch of guys with rifles jumping up and getting machine gunned. All these men have to be clothed, they have to be fed, they need water that they can drink and cook with, they need fuel for their lamps, they need medical treatment. And above all, the shells, 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 shells. The British bombardment at the Somme to begin the battle was so intense that at one point, 100 trains a day were bringing up munitions to the railheads. And of course, then some poor Tommy's got to pick them up and schlep them through the mud. You finally get up to the gunners, boom, they fire them off. Oh no, I got to go back and get another one. There's something like 250,000 horses died in the war, mostly not in cavalry charges, but in struggling to bring food and munitions up and wounded men back through the same appalling mud the men were fighting their way through. And that's one of the reasons to this day in the World War I battlefields in northeastern France, if it rains, artifacts appear. Discarded munitions, which can be quite dangerous, bits of uniforms, shoes, everyday objects, pipes, penknives. It's incredible how much effort was poured in. And one of the reasons the war went on for so long is not that the combatants were mentally weak, but that they were industrially strong, each able to pour in so much that neither can move the other for years at a time. It's not a tribute to the stupidity of men, but to their ingenuity in what is arguably a terrible purpose. The English Channel is in a pretty peaceful mood today, despite the wind. But the weather here certainly can be rough. Hence Chesterton's anecdote about the Frenchman asked if he'd had lunch on the boat crossing the channel, who replied, au contraire. And naturally, that brings me to the subject of socks. See, thinking about the logistical challenges of modern industrial warfare, the British forces fighting in France in the First World War wasn't just a matter of getting millions of men back and forth across the channel, safely, protected from submarines and mines. You also had to get across weapons and munitions, and then endless humdrum items like razor blades, combs, books, sweaters, and, believe it or not, 140 million pairs of socks. I mean, don't forget, this war is notorious, among other things, for trench foot. You've got to find ways to keep men fed and clothed, as well as supplied with weapons, or they simply can't fight, regardless of what mood the channel happens to be in. If you want to get a sense of the intensity, the ingenuity, and the sheer scale of the war effort, you could hardly do better than to visit one of the tunnels here at the Canadian Memorial at Vimy. This is just a side storeroom in the second largest tunnel, which stretched for over a kilometre from well behind the lines up to the front trenches, enabling Canadians to move supplies without being vulnerable to German shelling. These tunnels were dug by the Royal Engineers. They went about 4 to 5 meters a day. Every meter of the chalky rock they hacked out with pickaxes required them to carry 200 bags back to the surface. There were special rooms for runners, a particularly dangerous job. Remember, during World War I, a major command and control problem, the radios were just too balky and too bulky to be of use at that point. If you had a telephone with its cable, some fool would fire a shell and cut it. So these guys, all volunteers, life expectancy in combat roughly 1 to 2 weeks, would have to run back and forth with bits of paper in a circumstance in which it was plenty dangerous to stay underground clutching a rifle. Along with these tunnels used for communication and supplies, and on the day of the battle, 900 troops burst out from the other end, there were also saps dug under the German position, elaborate tunnels, dangerous to dig, especially because sometimes they'd hear German voices on the other side of a thin wall and have to stop. If the Germans heard them, it wouldn't just give away their position. They might poke a hole in the wall and throw grenades through. Gradually, they would pack enormous quantities of explosives underneath the German position. If you weren't having much luck storming the trenches or shelling them, you could always blow them sky high from beneath, assuming it didn't go off prematurely or fail to explode. It's an incredible effort in every dimension. It's far more to this war than just men running around getting machine gunned, although, of course, for the runners, that was kind of a big part of it. Here in Calais, you'd think we're a long way from the battlefields of the First World War. But this monument to the Dover Patrol that kept U-boats out of the channel throughout the conflict reminds us that we're not. There was another war out there. In terms of surface combatants, there was only ever one really major battle, the inconclusive clash called the Battle of Jutland in mid-1916, the only time the mighty dreadnoughts ever met. It's interesting, they said of the head of the British Navy that he was the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon. That afternoon never came. Der Tag never came. The German High Seas Fleet limped home and it never ventured forth again. But the U-boats did. The Dover Patrol kept them out of the channel with strenuous effort, including a net stretching from England to France. But U-boats were throughout the North Atlantic, trying to strangle Britain, posing a geopolitical threat that eventually brought the United States into the war. The victory of the anti-submarine warriors was of enormous importance. The Germans certainly understood that after they conquered France in World War II. The Nazis blew it up. Of course, it was rebuilt to stand here and remind us of the battles that took place under the waves and on them, as well as in the mud. Home sweet trench. What could possibly convince a man to leave these comforts, to get up into no man's land, get hung up on barbed wire, and be disemboweled by a machine gun? Unless, of course, he was ordered to do it by a witless and heartless general. But that is a complete misunderstanding of the nature of the war. In the First World War, something like 60% of all the casualties were caused by artillery fire. The reason generals kept ordering men to attack is that to leave them where they were was to sentence them to certain death. I mean, yeah, going over the top was not an attractive alternative, but under the circumstances, it wasn't an irrational thing to do or to order men to do. Even the noise of a simulated bombardment here at the Musée SOMME 1916 in Albert, France is almost unendurable. And I know I'm not about to be blown to bits. Eugene Sledge, in his memoir of fighting with the Marines in World War II in the Pacific, said shelling was a nightmare like no other. When it started, time stopped. You never knew if it had been 5 minutes or 2 hours. And one of the things that's generally not appreciated about World War I, the reason why men were willing to jump out of trenches and charge machine guns, other than because some nit with a revolver and permission to shoot them if they didn't go had ordered them to, is that it was the artillery that did the bulk of the killing on both sides. In a way, it's an immensely impressive logistical achievement. The Allies and the Central Powers pouring the industrial prowess and inventiveness of the late 19th century into the task of killing men on an unprecedented scale, firing millions and millions of shells, day after day, week after week, month after month. In a ghastly way, it's an impressive achievement. One of the most harrowing aspects of World War I, underlined by this exhibit on battlefield medicine here at the In Flanders Fields Museum in Ypres, is trying to provide medical care under the conditions of trench warfare. The dirt, the danger, and the lack of adequate surgical and other techniques. There were no antibiotics. Those came along in time for the Second World War, but terrible infections, men dying of gangrene, all sorts of horrors here. In the First World War, when you think about it from a technological point of view, it seems to me it's a period when people apply techniques they already had, refine them, develop, for instance, effective combat aircraft. They don't really invent a lot of things, though there are a few, and they show mankind at its worst and at its best. The First World War saw the first blood bank and also the first flamethrower. It saw the vacuum tube developed and poison gas. And also, here's an odd one, the tampon. So many men were wounded in the war that there was an urgent need for bandaging material. This led to the development of cellulose cotton, basically cotton wadding made from trees rather than from cotton plants, produced in enormous quantities. And as French nurses handled the stuff, they realized that this extraordinarily absorbent soft material had another promising use as well. It was picked up by British and American and Canadian nurses, and after the war, commercially, tampons started to be manufactured, though it was some years before anybody was willing to advertise them. They seemed a little bit distasteful, though, compared to World War I. I'm not sure what could seem distasteful. At any rate, by 1926, Montgomery Ward was advertising them. And there are other technological advances, too. I mean, the tank makes its first appearance in World War I. You see in the early films, these things are clumsy, they're beasts, they get stuck in trenches, they seem almost a feeble parody of a warfighting machine. But you look at the tanks of mid-1918, they're a lot different than the ones that foundered at Cambrai and elsewhere. In these small ways, human beings made significant advances in the most horrible things they could do to one another and in the things that could make life genuinely better.
The naval war was extremely important, really fundamental in some aspects of the war, and it's being more thoroughly appreciated now. I guess the clearest example is the British blockade of Germany. And at first their efforts were ineffective because they had to respect the rights of a very powerful neutral, that is the United States, which reserved the right to continue its trade. But through the war, the United States began to cooperate more closely with the British. And then in 1917 and 1918, the British blockade became devastatingly effective, resulting in widespread hunger, shortages of key resources all through Germany. And it was in large part the social unrest caused by the economic damage caused by the blockade that resulted in Germany suing for peace in 1918.
In 1916, from Verdun to the Somme, the Western Front's trench war meat grinder slaughtered men endlessly over a few hundred yards of bloody mud. On the Eastern Front, Russia's March Lake Narach offensive in Belarus to relieve pressure on Verdun failed disastrously. Despite a 10-to-1 manpower advantage, tactical incompetence cost the Russians over 120,000 casualties to just 20,000 Germans without significant gain. In June in Ukraine, the Brusilov offensive's unorthodox use of surprise and shock troops instead of long bombardment and mass frontal assault nearly broke Austria-Hungary and brought Romania into the Allied side. But while Brusilov's tactics caught German and later British eyes, his offensive gave the Tsar's armies a horrifying 1.4 million casualties. And after Germany and its allies overran Romania in a fall counterattack, a longer front to defend. At sea, the battleship clash at Jutland was a tactical draw, but a strategic British victory. And despite considerable success with restricted U-boat warfare against unconvoyed British ships, the German government pondered a negotiated peace by year's end. But Berlin brushed off American mediation attempts while the Allies demanded withdrawal from occupied territories and indemnities for damages. So the meat grinder kept turning.
The Eastern Front mattered a great deal in key areas of the war. Obviously, we know that the Russians began to collapse in 1917. The last attempt on the part of the Russians to wage a major part in the war against Germany was in June of 1917, and that didn't work. But if you go back to 1915 and 1916, the Germans are devoting from 40 to 50% of their total troop commitment to the Eastern Front. And it is very difficult to imagine what that would have meant to the British and French if there had not been an Eastern Front to absorb such large numbers of Germans. Certainly that's the case for the background to the events that take place in 1916 at the Somme, where the question is whether or not the Great Russian Offensive of 1916 will draw away enough German troops to make it possible for the British to break through at the Somme.
On July 1st, 1916, after a thunderous bombardment, the British Army went over the top on the Somme and immediately suffered the worst day in their history. Nearly 20,000 killed, 40,000 wounded for minimal gain. The battle went on and became a byword for futile bloodshed. But that, I maintain, is too hard on the British commanders. What else were they going to do other than surrender? Remember, war is the last option for people for whom giving up is the second last option, but not for those who are determined to carry on. And the British had to attack because the Germans had come up with the idea of bleeding the French white at Verdun further south starting in February 1916, and the French army was close to breaking. Something had to be done to draw the Germans off. Now, the British artillery fire didn't pound the German positions into nothing, as they'd hoped, because the Germans had learned to dig elaborate trenches. This reconstruction, this is at the Musée Somme 1916 in Albert, France, shows you that this is deep, it's solid, it's got living quarters, it's got supplies. This is somewhere men could live as well as die, and the German defenders did live. Well, some of them, but a lot of them died as well. What's often forgotten about the Somme is that it worked. The British paid a terrible price. They had something on the order of 620,000 casualties by the time the battle finally petered out. And it was on the first day of the offensive that the Newfoundland Regiment at Beaumont-Hamel was all but annihilated, a tragedy for the unit and for the communities from which its soldiers came. But the German casualties at the Somme were higher, something like 680,000, and believe it or not, for all their normal precision, the Germans counted casualties less carefully than the Allies. One German officer later referred to the Somme as the muddy grave of the German field army and of our confidence in our commanders. After the beating that the Germans took at Verdun and on the Somme, they withdrew into the Hindenburg Line. Their army was so badly harmed by these engagements that they were forced to turn to unrestricted U-boat warfare in the hope of starving Britain, and it was U-boat warfare and the sinking of neutral ships that ended up bringing the Americans into the war and ensuring Germany's final defeat. Before you criticize the British commanders on the Somme, ask yourself, how would you have overcome defensive positions like this with the technology of 1916? It's true that tactics would later evolve, but what they did, slow and dreadful as it was, actually was effective under very, very difficult circumstances. And that should not be forgotten, even as we also remember the terrible cost of the battle. The crosses just seem to go on forever here at the Douaumont ossuary in Verdun, France, scene of one of the nightmarish battles whose name, like Somme or Passchendaele, evokes an eruption of hell itself onto the surface of the earth. There are over 12,000 markers here, including one section reserved for Muslim soldiers from France's overseas territories. And yet that is just a small fraction of the number who lost their lives in this dreadful battle in the spring of 1916. From February through June, the French and Germans between them had some 700,000 casualties here, and of those, 300,000, nearly half, are dead or, that dreaded word, missing. Most of those buried here at least have a name. There are some unknown soldiers here, but for the most part, there are names. That monotonous drumbeat: died for France, March 22nd, 1916. Died for France, April 7th, 1916. Died for France, June 21st, 1916. Died for France, November 8th, 1916. On and on it goes, 1916. Yet at least they have a name. They have a final resting place. In the ossuary itself are the remains of over 130,000 French and German soldiers who could never be identified, whose families never had a marker at which they could lay flowers, a place they could come and talk about the lives of those who survived the war, tell of the birth of children, grandchildren, nephews, the continuing story of life, or simply think about the person they had lost. Over 130,000 anonymous French and German soldiers, united in death and in remembrance of the waking nightmare we call war. For some reason, of the tens upon tens of thousands of World War I soldiers' graves that we've encountered on our tour of France and Belgium, this one here at Dud Corner Cemetery in LOOS-EN-GOHELLE particularly struck me. It's of an unidentified soldier, and it has the usual inscription, "A soldier of the Great War, known unto God." But then they have his regiment, Royal Scots Fusiliers, and I'm not being disrespectful here, but I'm trying to emphasize what it is when we ask men to serve in war, what we're asking them to go through. Fundamentally, this inscription says something like, "We found his uniform, but we never found his head." He was lying there dead, and none of us could tell who it was of the people we'd just been with. And to me, the horror of war, it's not just the possibility of death. It's the possibility of terrible death, of being maimed, of seeing friends maimed, of killing strangers on the other side and seeing them in the undignified and hideous pose of death. It is a truly nightmarish prospect, and somehow, on a mass scale, it can just be numbing, but you take it down to one person and think of how he ended up and what his buddies found, and it really makes you see how ghastly it is to be in combat. Here at the Douaumont ossuary in Verdun, there are the unidentified remains of over 130,000 French and German soldiers. Not even complete skeletons in the crypt. There are piles of femurs, hip bones, skulls. This is all that a man's hopes and dreams came to. And among them might easily be the bones of Puddleglum the Marshwiggle, Frodo Baggins, Gandalf and Legolas, even the great lion Aslan himself. You see, both C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien served in the First World War, and both nearly died. Lewis was hit by friendly artillery fire. Tolkien, who served with the Lancashire Fusiliers on the Somme, got a bad case of trench fever. And if they had died, neither Narnia nor Middle-earth would ever have come into being. And it makes you wonder what the men who lie here might have done had they lived. They might have been hailed as inventors, as doctors, as great novelists, or borne the honorable titles of husband, friend, Papa. Instead, they lie here, unknown, mute, though hardly inglorious. We're on the road between LOOS-EN-GOHELLE and Ypres via Neuve-Chapelle. And my cameraman says, look, there's another one, but it's kind of different. Let's go see what it is. And we get out, and it's Cemitério Militar Português, with apologies to the men who lie here for the way I just said that. But this monument to soldiers from Britain's oldest ally who died in the Great War is a reminder of just how many nations and how many men contributed to the Western victory, including marker after marker, Soldado Português Desconhecido, unknown Portuguese soldier, morto pela patria. And right behind me, the Indian Memorial, a reminder of another nation who gave so many men for victory in the Great War. The Indian Memorial stands outside Neuve-Chapelle because it's here that the Indian Corps fought together as a unit for the first time in March of 1915. On its walls, the names of over 4,700 Indian soldiers and laborers who died on the Western Front and have no known grave. Every one of them somebody's child. And they go on and on the way they do at the Australian Memorial, at VIMY, at Menin Gate, and elsewhere. But here the rhythm is just a little different. Hardlal Singh, Saeed Hussein, Mam Raj, lest we forget. The statue of George Baker outside the entrance to the Commons Chamber is one of the many treasures tucked away in the Gothic architecture of the Parliament buildings, along with the gargoyles, the portraits, and the stained glass. Baker's particularly worth seeking out because he's a member of Parliament. He was elected in 1911. He was also active in the militia. And when the First World War started, without giving up his seat in Parliament, he sought and received permission to raise a volunteer battalion from Quebec, the 5th Canadian Mounted, and to go overseas with them on active service. They were attached to the 3rd Canadian Division, and on June 2nd, 1916, at Sanctuary Wood south of Ypres, a ferocious German attack, Baker was killed, heroically organizing his men for defense, along, by the way, with the commander of the 3rd Canadian Division. Don't believe all the generals were hiding 100 miles behind the lines in safety. But Baker's a particularly remarkable example of a politician who, having voted for war, didn't then hide safely somewhere else, making patriotic speeches, voting defense budgets, and letting somebody else get killed. He himself went and risked and made the supreme sacrifice. And he has his reward. In some sense, he's the only war memorial on Parliament Hill that commemorates a particular individual. He stands here between a verse from the Bible, 2nd Maccabees, and a stanza from In Flanders Fields. He's also a monument to the spirit that got Canada through the First World War and that we really should remember to this day. The Hillside Cemetery in Le Quesnel has only a few dozen graves. It seems quite a small affair, although of course it would seem big if one of them was yours. It's characteristic of the burial places of men who were buried where they fell. They weren't wounded and later died of their wounds. They weren't subsequently moved to a larger cemetery. This one is remarkable, though, because it contains the grave of Lieutenant H.J. Goodyear. Shortly before he was killed, he wrote a very eloquent and moving letter to his mother about why he was fighting. This letter was subsequently read in Parliament during a debate on the budget on military expenditure. And it helped convince MPs that although the war had gone on for years, though the cost in lives and treasure had been enormous, it was worth continuing to fight, it was worth passing the appropriations.
The reputation of the Canadian Corps in the First World War is really a question of the growth of the capacity of the Corps after 1916. I think anyone who looked at the Canadians in 1915 at 2nd Ypres or in the Somme would say that they were valiant, they were well led, but no one would say that they were a particularly competent formation. It's the learning process that takes place at the Somme and in the preparations for Vimy Ridge that suggests for the first time that all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps are acquiring a level of competence which is unusual, that makes them comparable to the very best British or Australian soldiers. And in the aftermath of VIMY, their reputation continues to grow, so that by 1918, without question, the Canadian Corps is the premier fighting unit within the British Expeditionary Force on the Western Front.
Essex Farm Cemetery, outside Ypres, Belgium, is just one of more than 1,000 military and 2,000 civil cemeteries that contain the remains of nearly 750,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who were killed in the Great War, with 300,000 or so of whom have no known resting place as well. But this spot is special because it's here, sitting in the back of a field ambulance in May of 1915, that John McCrae wrote in Flanders Fields after presiding over the funeral of a close friend. And the poem is about loss, but it's about much more than that. Listen to the words. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, while in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with we who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. War is a terrible thing, but even participation in the First World War did not convince everybody involved that war should be avoided at any price. And consider J.R.R. Tolkien, who nearly died of trench fever during the conflict, and as he himself would later say, by 1918, all but one of his close friends were dead. In his epic trilogy about Middle-earth, The Lord of the Rings, he writes stirring scenes of battle, terrible enemies, glorious deeds performed against long odds. The arrival of the riders of Rohan at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, the death of King Theoden, these are regarded not as tragedies but as triumphs. Theoden's final words, "I go to my fathers, even in whose mighty company I shall not now feel ashamed." That isn't to say that war is not terrible. Tolkien himself called it hideous. But his friend C.S. Lewis, also in the Narnia Chronicles, describes battles as things that must be done in which there is honor and glory as well as horror, terror, and death. And it's important to understand that the First World War was awful, but war is always awful. Even the Greeks knew that few die well who die in war. Now that may have been true of the First World War to an unusual extent and on an unusual scale, but it doesn't mean that war must always be avoided no matter what the alternative. It doesn't mean that to us who hold the torch. It did not mean that to those who threw it to us. If I say to you, Australia, you're going to get through a lot of word associations, I would imagine, before you come to World War I, Western Front, Villers-Bretonneux. Unless you're Australian, you probably don't recognize the importance of this place to that country. But here at the Franco-Australian Museum in Villers-Bretonneux, there's a sign saying, "N'oublions jamais l'Australie," do not forget Australia. Why? Well, the Australians played a critical part in the closing stages of World War I here. First, they were sent off to the wretched operation in Gallipoli, failed landing to try to unravel the Ottoman Empire, and finally got pulled out of that, given a brief rest, and then said, "Hey, how'd you like to go take part in the Battle of the Somme?" The Australians must have been thinking, somebody hates us, and it could well be the British. But they fought with distinction on the Western Front, like the Canadians. And in 1918, when the final German offensive did break the Allied lines, all hands on deck to stop them, the Americans, the Canadians, the British, and the Australians. It was here at Villers-Bretonneux that they stopped the German advance. And then, on April 25th, the same day the disastrous Gallipoli operation began, they recaptured the town. This is also, by the way, the first place that there was ever a battle between tanks on both sides. But it's critically important because it was here that the Australians stood their ground and turned the tide, along with their allies, in that critical moment in 1918. N'oublions jamais l'Australie. We find ourselves at one more solemn and beautiful memorial here in Loos. But the name of it, this might seem a little incongruous, it's called Dud Corner Cemetery. That's because of the number of unexploded shells they found here when they were building it in the 1920s. But to me, that name is also an appropriate tribute to the blunt and gritty humor of the British Tommies that helped to carry them through that terrible conflict. The same impulse that made them, since they couldn't pronounce Ypres properly, call it Wipers, and then make up rude rhymes about there was a young Tommy at Wipers, got shot in the backside by snipers, and I can't really do the rest of it. I also think the name is an appropriate tribute to an open society. So the Battle of Loos was fought here in 1915. The same year, there was a public political scandal in Britain over the quantity and quality of munitions. Now, there are always people in times of national security crisis who say, don't talk about problems out loud. For one thing, the enemy will find out things we don't want him to hear. For another, it'll give him aid and comfort. He'll think we're divided. But that's exactly backwards. There's no more important time to thoroughly explore a problem and find a proper solution than when the outcome really matters, like in a war. And that's why, to me, the name Dud Corner Cemetery is a very appropriate tribute to the British soldier and the cause for which he fought. Americans proud of their nation's military history can tell you about battles from Valley Forge to Gettysburg, from Midway to Omaha Beach, from Inchon to Quai Son and beyond. But what of this imposing Aisne-Marne monument here in Château-Thierry, France? How many Americans could tell you, how many Canadians could tell you that the United States lost more men in World War I than Canada did? 116,000. The Americans got into the war late, but they played a critical role, first in stopping the last great German offensive at the gates of Paris. That's where the 3rd U.S. Infantry Division acquired the nickname Rock of the Marne, and then in pushing the Germans back in the Aisne-Marne offensive in July, August, and then the Meuse-Argonne offensive going on until the very end of the war. The monument on the other side has a map showing the contributions of the 1st Division, the 3rd Division, the 4th Division, the 29th, and others in defeating the Kaiser's armies. It was extremely costly, and it's true that it didn't lead, as the victories in the Second World War did, to a sustained American role in maintaining world order. Instead, the 1920s and 1930s are nothing but might-have-beens. But that doesn't change the fact that the American contribution in World War I was costly, it was essential. It was, in fact, monumental.
In 1917, when the war was extremely strained and both the Allies and the Central Powers were at the limits of the resources, the Germans decided to roll the dice. They believed that if they launched a new U-boat campaign, submarine campaign, they could whittle down Allied supplies before the Americans could come into the war, and that thus the Central Powers could win the war. The Germans nearly, well, I won't say nearly won, but within a few months in 1917, supplies to Britain had so fallen off that the British government was having to consider reductions in, not in the main Western Front theater, but in many of the other crucial theaters, such as the Mediterranean. The British, by the summer of 1917, are losing 1 in 4 ships that tries to cross the Atlantic. So the U-boat threat was extremely serious. They operate exclusively in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean. They're extremely important in the Mediterranean because remember, the Mediterranean is also a very hot theater of war. But the U-boats were able to operate freely right from the beginning because they could get underwater and get around British patrols and get under British patrols. They were able freely to operate off of the west coast, the Atlantic coast of England. And then as the U-boat campaign intensified in 1917, 1918, the Germans built larger U-boats. And in fact, there was, maybe 8 or 9 that crossed the Atlantic and operated right off of Newfoundland, off of Halifax, off of Cape Breton, did serious damage off of New York, and operated right down to the coast of Virginia. Yeah, they had only a few dozens when the war began, but as they realized the potential of the submarine in the early part of the war, they began to build more. And in 1917, when they really try to launch an all-out offensive, they have in the vicinity of 140, 150 U-boats, which compares to about 225 at the maximum expansion of the U-boat fleet during the Second World War. So it's very nearly on the same scale in the First World War.
In 1917, the logjam began to break. both ways. The desperate Germans declared unrestricted submarine warfare in January, and in March a liberal revolution forced Russia's Tsar to abdicate. But his successors continued the fighting. In early April, the U-boat campaign brought an American declaration of war, and in the British Arras offensive, Canadians captured Vimy Ridge. Unleashed U-boats then wreaked havoc, sinking 1 in 4 merchant ships headed for Britain. And in May, the disastrous French Nivelle offensive south of Arras collapsed amid desertions and mutinies among 54 divisions, opening the road to Paris. But the Germans discovered it too late, partly because of the desperate British diversionary attack at Passchendaele. New French commander Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun and later villain of Vichy, then settled down to wait for the tanks and the Americans. But in Russia, the October Revolution brought in Lenin's anti-war Bolsheviks, who accepted a harsh German peace. British convoys and American ships then stemmed the U-boat tide. Canadians took the ruins at Passchendaele itself in November, menacing enemy supply lines, and almost 400 tanks punched through German lines on dry ground at Cambrai, south of Ypres, before outrunning their own supply lines, while Allied forces captured Jerusalem in December. But battle-hardened German troops were moving west for one last desperate gamble.
When Canadians come here to the Vimy Memorial, they're likely to think of the sorrow and loss of the war, of Mother Canada mourning her fallen sons, particularly those whose names are inscribed here because they have no known resting place. Or they think of the sense of nationhood that arose from success in this battle. But there's much more to it. The battle is important to Canada's sense of itself because it was important to the Western effort in the war. In the first place, to seize and hold an objective during an offensive in the spring of 1917, at a time when the French army was reeling on the verge of mutiny from one more botched offensive, the British, bloodied and exhausted, the Americans formally in the war, but many months away from rendering effective help, and the Russians collapsing into anarchy and then the evil of Bolshevism. A strategic victory at that point was important militarily and psychologically. But there's far more to it than that. Is the tactics used to achieve victory at Vimy Ridge, the creeping barrage with troops leaning in behind it instead of waiting for the shelling to stop before coming out of their trenches, giving the defenders time to reorganize, the leapfrog technique, where a battalion would take an objective modestly close by, dig in to hold it, the next one would leapfrog over, seize another objective, and keep going until when the offensive ran out of steam, the troops were not overextended and vulnerable to a counterattack. The careful rehearsal, the mining and sapping underneath, all these things helped to break the stalemate, the futile trench warfare that had gone on for over 2 years. They were, of course, adapted by the Allies and by the Germans and helped restore the war of movement, to the point that, as one writer put it, in 1918, trenches were reduced from insuperable obstacles to speed bumps. That was a vital contribution to the war ending and to it ending successfully, and it's due to the hard work and imaginative thinking of the Canadians. That's what made the victory here at Vimy Ridge so crucial to the course of the war.
One of the difficulties throughout the battles prior to 1918 is that the British generals, like the French generals, are always trying to do too much. They interpret what happens on the battlefield as leading to the possibility of a breakthrough, and therefore they press the troops forward, and by then the Germans have brought sufficient reinforcements that the advance forward is impossible. The nice thing about Vimy Ridge is there was time to rehearse the battle, time to train anyone, but the purpose of Vimy Ridge was to get up on top of it and hold it rather than go forward from Vimy Ridge. If you were in a British division down on the right, you were supposed to be going forward in the flat ground. But Vimy Ridge was the hinge of the German defenses, and once it was taken, the key thing was to hold on to it. So a well-trained army, well-led, but with an objective that could be taken and held.
These are the Flanders fields, and the birds singing around me, they are John McCrae's larks. It's beautiful, fertile farmland, but this heavy, wet soil makes for a horrible battlefield. The British spent over 2 years here trying to capture a vital strategic feature. That's the Wildschate Ridge behind me. Under normal circumstances, it's a low hill, but in those days, it was a mountain. They finally took it in June of 1917, preparation for the Battle of Passchendaele, straightening out the lines south of the Ypres salient, in an amazing engineering feat. 19 tunnels deep under the German positions. They call it the Battle of the Mines, packed with millions of pounds of explosives, all detonated simultaneously, the largest man-made explosion to that point in history. They say it was so loud you could hear it in London. By the way, there are 4 further south they didn't set off for tactical reasons. They lay dormant until one was hit by lightning in 1955 and blew up on its own, which is kind of a disquieting thought. So the British finally got to the top, but it took them 2.5 years to get there. That gives you some sense of how hard it was to fight trench warfare in Flanders fields. A sign of the change and of Back to the Future is that on this spot, on March 30th, 1918, Squadron C of Lord Strathcona's horse mounted a critical cavalry charge. Yes, cavalry charge. They were carrying out mounted reconnaissance. They came across Germans with machine guns. Lieutenant Gordon Flowerdew drew his sword and commanded them to charge. Now, you will not be terribly surprised to learn that 70% of them were killed or wounded. Flowerdew himself, critically injured, won a Victoria Cross, but died of his wounds. But the Germans were disorganized by the charge. They were set back 24 hours, and by the time they tried to resume their forward advance, the French had brought up troops and artillery, and the Germans didn't get any further. By this point, it was again a war of movement, not mostly of cavalry charges, but no longer would men fight in static trenches. Le Canal, where this monument to the Canadian effort in the closing stages of World War I stands, is a name much less familiar than the bloody horrors from the worst part of the war like Verdun or Somme or Passchendaele. But it's an extremely important site because the Canadians, who'd marched up the old Roman road raising a cloud of dust like the legionnaires before them, launched their portion of the 100 Days right here, that dramatic surprise attack on the morning of August 8th, 1918 that the Germans called the Black Day for their army, began the final push to victory. The monument's here because Le Canal, over there behind me, is the one and only objective the Canadians didn't reach on the first day, but they got there on the second day. This was the beginning of the end for the Germans. The 100 Days were very costly, but it's where Canadian regiments got battle honors with names like Pursuit de Mons that evoke the final decisive war of movement that won the First World War. It's an important part of the story. It's an important part of the Canadian story. It's an important part of how the war evolved and how the war ended. The French countryside is dotted with memorials, great and small, to all kinds of historical events, including the great wars of the 20th century. This one, though modest, is unusual because it's an American monument. It marks the farthest east that American forces got in the Great War. In the last stages of the Meuse-Argonne offensive in November 1918, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division fought its way to this spot. And as a final ghastly note about the war, the list of dead and missing here, there are almost as many missing as there are dead, even at the very end of the war. That's the way the battles were.
In the Middle East, after withdrawing from Gallipoli, defending Suez from Ottoman attacks, and losing besieged Kut in Mesopotamia in April 1916, the British gained the initiative. They crushed a Turkish-backed guerrilla war in eastern Egypt. Then, Lawrence of Arabia helped instigate Arab revolt against the Turks, beginning with June 1916's Battle of Mecca, led by Sharif Hussein, later founder of Jordan's and Iraq's royal houses. Elaborate, even delusional German efforts to foment jihad against the Allies failed completely, despite Ottoman Sultan Mehmed V proclaiming holy war against some infidels on behalf of others and presiding over the Armenian genocide Turkey denies to this day. But the sick man of Europe was even less able to wage major war than Russia, and the Ottomans lost ground steadily to Britain in the Middle East and Russia in the Caucasus. Baghdad fell in March 1917, Gaza in late fall, and on December 11th, General Allenby became Jerusalem's first Christian ruler since the Crusades. The September 1980 Battle of Megiddo, biblical Armageddon, finished the Ottoman War, but not the trouble. During the war, Britain and France promised substantial Arab self-rule, while promising one another continued colonial control. But Britain also promised a Jewish homeland in the November 1917 Balfour Declaration, and under their post-war League of Nations Palestine mandate, haltingly but consistently allowed Zionist immigration to lay the foundations for Israel's rebirth after the Holocaust.
Well, the problem for the Germans in attempting to forge an alliance with the Ottoman Empire is that the Ottoman Empire may have valiant soldiers, but logistically and in terms of the material of war, it is heavily dependent upon German supplies and to some extent German leadership. I guess it would be a toss-up as to whether it costs the Germans more to have an ally of the Ottoman Empire, or it costs the British more to fight the Ottoman Empire, because the British divert enormous resources not only to the Gallipoli campaign, but to Salonika and to other areas in the east, which are part of the attempt to turn attention away from the fighting on the Western Front and try and find a way around the German defenses of the Western Front. So both sides are, if you will, diverted to the Eastern Front, but it's pretty much in balance. The events that are taking place in Palestine and in the attacks upon the Ottoman Empire are important in the sense that the war is still far from understood to be over when many of those actions take place. The British were thinking, after all, about the probability of continuing the war, needing to continue the war into 1919 and even 1920, because they could not see a way of defeating the German army in the field, and they did not anticipate the degree of collapse that would take place within Germany and within the German army in 1918.
Germany's March 1918 Operation Michael, with tactics pioneered by Brusilov and polished at Vimy, and fresh Eastern Front troops, sought to break the Allied lines, drive the British to the sea, and the French past Paris, basically repeating 1914's Schlieffen Plan. It almost worked. A war of movement carried the Germans nearly to Amiens and Paris before desperate British, French, Canadian, Australian, and increasingly American troops somehow dug in and stopped the attack, killing or wounding 250,000 of Germany's best troops. The Germans had underestimated the Americans. The United States had just 127,588 soldiers when they declared war in April 1917, but 300,000 in France by March 1918 and over 2 million by November. With two giant American offensives and the Anglo-French 100 Days starting August 8th, the Allied and Associated Powers, a term U.S. President Wilson demanded, drove the Germans from France and Belgium before unrest brought the Kaiser's November 9th abdication and a November 11th armistice. The Great War was over, but not its consequences. From Russia's hideous civil war to the Spanish flu to the disastrous failure of the Versailles settlement from which so many 20th century evils would flow.
The Allies eventually won the war on the 11th of November 1918. The question is, how did they get there? How did they break the German armies on the Western Front? Well, for one thing, Germany was outnumbered. But Germany had a better army at the start of the war, and they had, through their Schlieffen Plan, through their opening phases of battle, occupied the best parts of the Western Front, a ground that offered them open sights to shoot down the Allied soldiers. And so in 1914 and in 1915 and 1916, the first half of the war, the Allies fruitlessly attack the Germans over and over again. They don't have enough artillery support, they don't have enough machine guns, they don't have tanks, their chemical warfare is not yet in full force, and they're not able to drive the Germans back. But by 1917, and really at the critical battle of the Battle of Arras, where the Canadians fight at Vimy Ridge, that becomes a bit of a turning point for the Allies. They are gaining and gathering more artillery pieces, Most battles are preceded by millions of shells being fired, and eventually they drive the Germans back across the battlefield. And Germany begins to wilt under these relentless attacks on the Somme, at Battle of Arras, at Passchendaele, and finally during the 100 Days campaign. While the home front is starving from the Royal Navy British blockade, as the casualties are now numbering in the millions of dead and wounded, Germany is defeated on the battlefield, pushed back in a series of campaigns by the American forces, the French forces, the British forces, and the Dominion forces. And eventually Germany sues for peace, or at least agrees to a temporary armistice on the 11th of November 1918, and that will lead to a long-lasting peace.
No matter what angle you're looking at the First World War from, when you get to the point where they sign an armistice and the killing is going to stop, you're going to go, oh, thank God that finally ended. And it ended here at a clearing in Compiègne in a railway car, where the Germans signed an armistice that led to the Treaty of Versailles, and the war stopped. And of course that railway car is preserved, almost. It's actually a bit more of a tangled story, and one that throws interesting light on the nature of historical memory. You think about the feeling, and we won, about the end of the war in 1918. Well, of course, there were people who didn't feel that way. And in 1940, when Hitler conquered France, he made the French sign the surrender in the same railway car, in the same place. And a whole lot of Germans, even if they weren't Nazis, had to feel some kind of sense at last we're vindicated for the sacrifices of the Great War. Of course, Hitler's war didn't turn out too well for Germany in the end. As a matter of fact, it didn't turn out too well for the original railway car either. The Germans took it back to Berlin, and at some point, it's not quite clear how, it was destroyed. Maybe by the SS in a fit of pique when they knew they were losing the war, maybe an Allied bombardment. At any rate, it was destroyed. But then the French got an identical car, put the original number on it, period furniture, built a museum to house it. And if you go to the museum website, it's very interesting, it says that the purpose of the museum is to commemorate the armistice of 1918 and also the moins glorieux, that is the less glorious one, in 1940. Something the French wish hadn't happened, but they're not going to erase it from the history books because it was bad. That's the nature of real historical memory. It's a critical difference between the Allies and their enemies in the world wars. If the Nazis had been in a position to do so, even in losing the war, they'd have erased any memory of things they wished hadn't happened. The French, in victory, preserved the painful memory of 1940 as well as the bittersweet one of 1918. Amid the canola fields and rolling landscape of northeastern France, in the center of small towns, in the big cities, tucked away in lonely hollows, on magnificent hillsides, and beside busy highways, there are memorials to the Great War everywhere. And when it comes to history, I'm struck in visiting France and Belgium by the thought that, although history makes for good reading, there is a downside to having too much of it happen to your country. I imagine ordinary Frenchmen and Frenchwomen would have been just as happy if history had gone the other way and left them to live their lives in peace.
We cannot count the war's costs. Even casualty estimates vary enormously. Wikipedia says 16 million killed, 20 million wounded, including maybe 7 million civilians dead. But other sources say 90% of those killed wore uniforms. It depends partly on what you consider direct consequences of the conflict. In any case, when over a quarter of soldiers killed have no known grave, and Russian and Ottoman archives are involved, precise counting is clearly impossible. Let one statistic speak for the others. France alone suffered 1.3 million dead out of 40 million people, including 1 in 3 men aged between 18 and 45 in 1914. The material costs of the war are so huge and its economic impact so vast, it makes no sense to do those sums either. Formal GDP actually grew in Britain, Italy, and the U.S., but resources devoted to shells, including 32 million fired at Verdun alone, are not wealth in the normal sense. As for the ruined farmland and smashed villages of France and Belgium, to hand Germany an entirely unrealistic and spuriously precise bill of 132 billion gold marks for loss and damage was a political rather than economic exercise, understandable, yet with dreadful consequences. But then, virtually all the war's consequences were dreadful, and none more than those endless rows of crosses inscribed, "A soldier of the Great War, known unto God."
I think the Versailles settlement is better than most historians give it credit for. It was not as punitive as it could have been, and I think here of the Germans who defeated the Russians on the battlefield and invoked a harsh, draconian peace on the Russians. The Allies were bruised and battered and bloodied, and they wanted revenge at the end of the war. And they forced Germany to pay war reparations, in effect to pay for the war, and they forced them to admit guilt. And historians have looked at those two clauses and thought that they were perhaps over the top. I think with 9 million battlefield dead, more than 20 million wounded in body, mind, and spirit, it would have been very hard to have found a more gentle peace. But Versailles then was used, certainly in Germany, throughout the 1920s and by Hitler's Nazi party to evoke this idea of an unfair war, that the Germans had fought valiantly, but the peace that had been invoked upon them was extremely harsh. And that, of course, tied into Germany's ruined economy in the 1920s, the absolutely devastating effects of the Depression on Germany. And so Versailles over time becomes something that the Germans point to as being extremely unfair. And I think if we put and go back in the context of the time in 1919, it could have been far harsher.
The most tragic aspect of the Great War is its bleak consequences. What Woodrow Wilson famously called a war to end all wars, though the phrase apparently originated with H.G. Wells, instead ushered in a century of war, genocide, and turmoil. Don't lay too much blame on the immediate post-war settlement. The Versailles Treaty and its fellows were punitive and caused resentment in the defeated Central Powers. And Wilson's failure to bring America into the League of Nations is a cautionary tale about arrogant idealism. But failure to resist aggression in the 1930s, from Manchuria in 1931 to Munich in 1938 and the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939, is not the fault of those who made peace in 1918 and 1919. Politicians' failure of nerve between the wars has complex roots, including economic depression and war weariness. But behind it all lies a loss of confidence in Western civilization. Of all the Great War's consequences, the tragic loss of life, waste of material, and geopolitical turmoil, its most damaging legacy in our own day was its shattering impact on faith in truth, the West, and permanent standards of decency and right conduct.
I find it a touching reflection on the nature of historical memory that here at the Durmont Ossuary in Verdun, there should stand this memorial that says it is dedicated to the French, Allied, and foreign volunteer Israelites who died for France between 1914 and 1918. In a nation still scarred by the anti-Semitic Dreyfus affair, this monument speaks to the way that men can find good even in great evil. Here at the Menin Gate in Ypres, Belgium, are recorded the names of almost 55,000 Commonwealth officers and soldiers who fell in the Ypres salient and have no known grave, including almost 7,000 Canadians. Last Post has sounded here every evening since 1930, except during the Second World War, having first been sounded in 1927 when the memorial was inaugurated. It's an extraordinary act of remembrance. Long after anyone who could have known anyone whose names are written here has passed on. And it's driven home to me something important that we've learned in our trip to France and Belgium, that remembrance is an active, not a passive thing. It wouldn't happen were it not for the legions of volunteers and staff who maintain the memorials, ensure that the graves are properly tended, who collect and exhibit artifacts in museums from Meaux to Villers-Bretonneux to Flanders and beyond, who take very seriously that pledge that we shall remember them, and who have shown us extraordinary hospitality in the course of our visit, have not only proudly displayed the artifacts and told us the stories, but have welcomed us. I want to mention one, Jean Mars from the Musée Franco-Australien, who not only showed us Australian sites, but also Canadian ones, then invited us to his home, shared beer with us, and showed us the artifacts he had personally collected. It is an extraordinary endeavor to preserve the memory and the names of those who defended this and other countries in the First World War. Jacques Chirac, President of the Republic, inaugurated this memorial to the Muslim soldiers who died for France during the First World War on June 25th, 2006. That's nearly 100 years after the end of the war. But the act of commemoration does not end when the war ends, nor when immediate memories of it fade, nor indeed when all those who took part have passed on. It's a permanent part of historical memory, because if the deeds in the past do not matter today, then the deeds of today will not matter in the future, and the whole thing is pointless. For Canada, as for all participants, the Great War was a tragic experience. The mournful figures here at the Vimy Memorial capture the harrowing sense of loss, the eternal aching regret that some other way was not found in the summer of 1914. But for Canada, at least, there is also a powerful element of redemption, the feeling that in the trenches of the First World War, and particularly here at Vimy Ridge, we found ourselves as a nation. And not just as a nation in the abstract, but as a particular kind of nation, as men of the West, people of the Anglosphere, devoted to liberty under law, individual rights, the inherent dignity of every human being. G.K. Chesterton once said that the soldier does not fight because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him, and that was the case for Canadians. At the top of the memorial are the figures of peace and justice. Right below them, faith and honor. This celebrates a righteous peace, not peace at any price. And that is why Canadians fought for their liberty again in the Second World War, stood on guard in the Cold War, sent troops to Afghanistan, and stand ready to do it again, because they know who they are as a people, and they know that their freedom is worth defending. Thank you for joining me for this documentary.